You know that feeling when you're falling in love? Like butterflies in your stomach. Maybe you can't stop thinking about that special someone.
Absolutely. Those early stages of romance can be incredibly intense.
Right. But have you ever stopped to think that your experience might be totally different from someone else's? Like even someone really close to you, like your best friend or your parents.
That's a great point. We tend to talk about being in love as if it's this one-size-fits-all experience.
Yeah, as if everyone feels the exact same way. But what if the intensity, the thoughts, even something as basic as how often you're intimate with your partner, what if all of that varies a lot from person to person?
Well, that's exactly what a team of researchers at the Australian National University, ANU, wanted to find out.
Okay, so tell me about this study. What did they do? What kind of data did they look at?
So they did this really interesting study where they surveyed 809 young adults who were all in romantic relationships.
All right, makes sense. All experiencing romantic love in some way.
Right. And to really dig deep into those love experiences, they zeroed in on four key areas: how intense those romantic feelings were, how often they were having obsessive thoughts about their partner, their level of commitment to the relationship, and, well, how frequently they were having sex each week.
I see. So they're looking at the emotional intensity, the mental aspect with the obsessive thoughts, the commitment, and also the physical intimacy. Pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, they tried to cover a wide range of what makes up romantic love.
And so for our deep dive today, our mission, I guess you could say, is to really break down the four distinct categories of romantic lovers that this ANU research identified.
Exactly. To try and get a better understanding of the many different ways love can look and feel for people. Because it clearly isn't the same for everyone.
Definitely. So let's dive right in. Who's the first type of lover they found and what makes them unique?
Well, the first group, and actually the biggest one in the study, they made up over 40% of the participants, were what the researchers called moderate lovers.
Moderate lovers. That kind of sounds like they're in the middle, not too extreme one way or the other.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. The researchers even said their characteristics were entirely unremarkable when it came to romantic love.
Unremarkable. So they weren't exactly setting the world on fire with their passion?
Not exactly. Basically, their romantic feelings weren't super intense, and they didn't have a ton of obsessive thoughts about their partner.
Okay, so maybe not the head over heels type.
But they did report relatively high levels of commitment to their relationships.
Oh, interesting. So they are invested, even if it's not super fiery.
Yeah, and their frequency of sex was, well, it was pretty moderate.
Makes sense. So it sounds like they're not swept away by intense emotions or constantly thinking about their partner, but they are committed and have a regular sex life.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary.
Anything else interesting about this moderate lover group?
One thing that stood out was that they were the most likely to be male.
Really? So moderate lovers are mostly guys?
Yeah.
That's curious.
And the researchers actually described this group as being fairly stock standard.
Stock standard, huh? All right, so that's the biggest group, the moderate lovers. Mostly guys, fairly typical. Let's move on to another type.
All right. Next up, we have the libidinous lovers.
Libidinous lovers. I'm guessing this group is a little more passionate.
Maybe a little. They were actually the smallest group in the study, making up a little under 10% of the participants.
Okay, so not so common. But what make them stand out?
Their most defining characteristic, a really high frequency of sex. We're talking an average of about 10 times per week.
Wow, 10 times a week. That is definitely not moderate.
Right. More than once a day on average.
So that pretty clearly distinguishes them from the moderate lovers. Anything else about them besides the very active sex life?
Yeah, there were a few other things. Compared to the other groups, they had the highest percentage of people who said they wanted to travel, spend more money than usual, and even smoke more cigarettes than usual.
Huh. So maybe a little bit more thrill-seeking in general.
It's possible. It makes you wonder if there's some kind of connection there, like a shared drive for exciting experiences.
That's really interesting. So we've got the biggest group, the moderate lovers, and the smallest, the very active libidinous lovers. What about the other two? Where do they fall on the spectrum?
Well, the next group is the second largest, after the moderate lovers. They're the intense lovers, and they made up over 29% of the participants.
Intense lovers. I feel like we all know someone like this totally head over heels.
You got it. That's exactly how the researchers described them.
But what does that intensity actually look like in their relationships based on the study?
Well, they basically had high scores across all four of those love measures we talked about. They reported the strongest feelings, they had the most frequent obsessive thoughts about their partner, they felt the most committed to their relationships, and they also had a relatively high frequency of sex.
So all aspects of their romantic experience were just amplified.
Yeah, pretty much. It wasn't just one thing that was more intense, it was everything.
Sounds like it could be both amazing and exhausting at the same time.
Probably a bit of both.
Did they find anything else about this group? Any other patterns or traits?
A couple of things. They had the highest proportion of people who said they felt in love before the relationship even started.
Ah, so maybe the love at first sight type?
Could be. And unlike the moderate lovers, this group had a higher proportion of women than men. About 60% were female.
Interesting. So more women falling intensely in love, even before the relationship begins, makes you wonder if there are some fundamental differences in how men and women experience those initial stages of love. What about their personalities? Any connections there?
Yeah, they also scored the highest on personality traits like agreeableness and conscientiousness. And, get this, they said they enjoyed their work the most out of all the groups.
That's not what I would have expected.
Right, you'd think with all that passion they'd be distracted at work, but no, they were really into it.
That's fascinating. So intensely in love, but also responsible, agreeable, and loving their jobs. That's a pretty interesting combination.
Definitely not what you might picture at first. And one more interesting thing, even though they were so intense in their romantic lives, they had the lowest rates of risky behavior, like dangerous driving, drinking more coffee and alcohol than usual, or taking more drugs.
Wow, so they're really focused on their relationships and their work, but not into taking unnecessary risks in other areas. All right, well, that leaves us with one last category. Who are they?
The last group is the mild lovers.
Mild lovers. Okay, I'm intrigued.
This was the second smallest group after the libidinous lovers, making up about 20% of the people in the study. And as you might guess, they were pretty consistent in having low scores across all those romantic love measures.
So the opposite of the intense lovers in many ways.
Exactly. The lowest intensity of romantic feelings, the fewest obsessive thoughts about their partner, the lowest scores on commitment, and the lowest frequency of sex.
Okay, so not feeling the big highs and lows, not constantly thinking about their partner, not as committed, and not having sex as often. Interesting. What other personalities? Anything stand out there?
They actually had the lowest scores for both extroversion and agreeableness.
So more introverted and maybe not as easygoing.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it kind of fits with the idea that they're not experiencing love in such an outward, intense way.
It does. Anything else about this group that's worth pointing out?
Well, this is kind of surprising. Even though they reported lower commitment in their current relationships, they also said they'd fallen in love more times than any other group. And they'd been in love for the shortest periods of time on average.
Really? So they fall in love more often, but it doesn't last as long, and it's not as intense. That's a fascinating contrast.
For sure. And they were also the most likely to be male and heterosexual.
Huh. Another interesting detail. So lots of interesting nuances with this mild lover group. It really highlights how diverse romantic experiences can be.
It really does. And I think it's important to emphasize, like the researchers did, that this isn't about judging anyone's style of loving or saying one is better than another. It's simply about recognizing that love is a complex thing that can look very different depending on the person.
Totally agree. No judgment here.
Yeah.
Just trying to understand all the different ways love can play out. Now, this whole categorization of lovers, it's based on data from the Romantic Love Survey from 2022, right? You mentioned earlier it was a pretty big deal. Can you tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, it's considered the world's biggest data set on romantic love. ANU put it together, and it involved data from over 1,500 young adults from 33 different countries, all sorts of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds.
Wow, that's a really impressive collection of data. And I read that they made all of that data available to other scientists.
Yep, they did. Adam Bode, who was the lead researcher, said that making the data public was a huge step forward for the science of love.
I can imagine.
Think about it. Romantic love is such a central part of being human. It shapes our relationships, our families, our culture. But surprisingly, there hasn't been that much research on it.
That is surprising. It seems like something we'd want to understand better.
Right. So the survey, it's like this treasure trove of information for researchers all over the world to dive into and learn from.
That's great. So you were saying earlier that the researchers were especially interested in the link between romantic love and sexual activity.
Right.
Why was that so important to them?
Well, we know that romantic relationships often lead to more sexual activity. That's not really a surprise.
Right.
But what they were really interested in was the role of romantic love itself as the main driver, especially in those early stages. And by finding these different patterns in how people experience love, they can start to understand that link better. Like, how do these different styles of love affect how often couples have sex?
Makes sense. So maybe how intensely you feel love influences your sexual desire.
Exactly. And the researchers even think these findings could tell us something about human evolution.
Whoa, evolution. That's a big jump.
I know, right? But their thinking is that if there are all these different types of lovers, it might mean that there's not just one evolutionary purpose for romantic love. Like maybe these different ways of experiencing love actually helped our ancestors survive and reproduce in different ways.
Hmm. I never thought about it like that.
Yeah,
So maybe the way we experience love is still evolving.
that's what they're suggesting. Pretty cool to think about, right?
It really is. It makes you wonder if we're all still figuring out this whole love thing as a species.
Maybe we are.
So as you're listening to this, I'm sure you're thinking about your own experiences with love, whether it's past relationships, current ones, or maybe even just observing the people around you.
Yeah, it's pretty hard not to relate this to your own life.
Right. We've talked about the moderate lovers, those kind of average, steady folks, the libidinous lovers who are all about the physical, the intense lovers who are totally swept away by passion, and the mild lovers who are more reserved and low-key.
Such a variety.
Do any of those profiles resonate with you? Maybe you see parts of yourself in a few different types.
I think a lot of people would.
And this brings up a really interesting question. If we start to understand that love isn't the same for everyone, could that actually help us have better relationships?
That's a great question. I think it definitely could.
Like if we can recognize and appreciate these different ways of loving, maybe we can be more understanding and less judgmental of our partners and the people around us.
Right. If you know someone tends to be a mild lover, you won't expect them to be showering you with grand romantic gestures.
Exactly. And on the other hand, if you're a moderate lover, partnered with an intense lover, you might be able to anticipate their needs and not be so thrown off by their intensity.
It can even help you communicate better and avoid misunderstandings.
And I think that's the key takeaway here. Love is complex and multifaceted. It's not just one thing, and there's no right or wrong way to experience it.
I think that's a great point to end on. Recognizing and appreciating the diversity of love can only lead to more understanding and empathy in our relationships.
Absolutely. And who knows, maybe this new understanding will even help us evolve as a species.
Maybe it will.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and happy loving.
Thanks for having me.